All right, I'm recording.
Same. Okay. Hello, my name is Hilary Word. I am a May 2020 graduate of the University of Mississippi's Southern Studies Master of Arts program, where I completed a thesis focusing on post-civil rights movement, African-American Southern speculative fiction. And today I am joined by author Maurice Carlos Ruffin to discuss his 2019 dystopian satire novel, We Cast a Shadow. But before we get into the discussion, just let me tell you a little bit more about Professor Ruffin and the impact of his work so far. So as I mentioned, he is the author of We Cast a Shadow, which was published by One World Random House. The novel was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. It was longlisted for the PEN America Open Book Prize, the Center for Fiction Prize, and the Aspen Words Literary Prize. The novel was also a New York Times Editor's Choice. Professor Ruffin is also the winner of several other literary prizes, including the Iowa Review Award in Fiction and the William Faulkner William Wisdom Creative Writing Competition Award for Novel in Progress. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Oxford American, Garden and Gun, and the Kenyon Review. He is a New Orleans native and a professor of creative writing at Louisiana State University. And most recently, he is the 2020-2021 John and Renée Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. His next book, The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, will be published by One World Random House in 2021. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here. I meant to say before we started, I also love your earrings. They're like gold purses.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. I'm so excited. I am a big speculative fiction fan. And so I really enjoyed reading this book. And I think those who are watching and who will hear about this book through our discussion will enjoy reading it later on too. But before we get into sort of the meat and bones of the discussion, I was just wondering if you would mind briefly explaining what We Cast a Shadow about is really at for its core for you. What's it really about at its core for you?
Really, it's about Blackness in America. And, when I wrote the book, it really came from a place of trying to understand myself, my family, and this American family, because we have some complicated problems that come from the fact that we are, as the PhD people would say, we're heterogeneous. We're not just Black folks, not just white folks, not just conservative, not just liberal. We're kind of across the board, and those conflicts throughout time have led to the present moment, which includes, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks and Trayvon Martin. I can go on with the names, right? Yeah. And so when I wrote the book, I couldn't have said that at the time because, I consider myself to be a literary writer. Somebody who sort of like takes an idea and explores it to get to the sort of the marrow within the bones. And as I look back on it from today, in 2020, I think that really I was trying to write a book in which Black folks who read it would see their experience. You know how it is when you see something that's just so weird, you kind of think, nobody's gonna believe this. They're gonna think I'm crazy. Yeah. And I feel like with a lot of my, my white brothers and sisters and people of other races, they sort of hear about the Black experience in America and they kind of go, well, that's an exception, being tailed in a store while you're trying to shop, or, that's an extreme circumstance that happens very rarely, being put over by a cop for breaking no laws. Mm-hmm. These different situations happen over and over again to us and to our family and to our friends that we hear about. And so I think that most Black folks who read it are gonna go, oh yeah, I've seen these things my entire life, even though it's set in the future, even though it's so called the dystopian novel. These things are just naturally part of what we experience as African Americans. But then on the flip side of that is how I think white people and other minorities, people of color, experience the book. And I think that, for a lot of them, and because I have a big friend circle, people that are part of my writing group, people that read my book as I was creating it, I think their experience is more along the lines of, and I've heard it many times, like they'll start the book out and in the first maybe 80 to 100 pages, 150 pages, they'll go, oh, I didn't get this. I didn't like this guy very much. And then there's a point in the book where they almost always go, oh, now I see. Mm-hmm. Now I understand. Almost as if they woke up Black one day. And they kind of went, that's what's been going on the entire time? And I think that a lot of the American experience are these things where people are sort of drawn in, at least for a few moments, where they go, oh, George Floyd was minding his own business. He wasn't an axe murderer. He wasn't a terrorist. He didn't commit a crime against humanity to be executed on the street. Now I see why people are fighting back against this throughout history. So I think that my book, it for me, it came to be this thing that was able to encompass the American experience, which obviously is experienced in different ways by different people. And I think as a Black man in this world, raised by a Black mother and a Black father, with my Black family, I think, again, like we sit kind of go, yeah, that's just that's our life. And I think everybody else, people I worked with over the years, people that I call my best friends, they would kind of go, man, I didn't know it was like that, bro. I mean, you were saying these things to me, but now I understand. And so I think that in that sense, I feel like I accomplished something that I didn't realize I set out to do. I just want to tell a good story. And I feel like, the literary writers who I respect so much, of course, Toni Morrison, her birthday, is right about now, and so many others. What they did was they told truths in a way that couldn't be denied. Nobody could say that this was just, she was playing around when she wrote, Song of Solomon, something like that. And so I really feel like that was part of my goal, and that's what I did with the book.
Okay. Wow. And so that makes me think, that makes me curious about sort of your creative process then for the novel. You set out to tell a story about being Black in America, but was that the first thing that you decided on as like part of the concept, or did you think individually about characters first, or the decision to make it satirical, or the decision to make it dystopian? What came first for you, or just this experience of being Black, or what else?
Yeah, so I think, when I was a very young writer, I didn't know anything. I would try and write these concepts, Black in America, But when it comes down to it, stories are made of skin and bones and blood.
Yeah.
And you have to decide well, who are these characters? What matters to them? What's sort of against them in the moment. And so I think certainly in the early draft of this novel, the very first time I encountered this main character, the narrator, he's a young dude in New Orleans, in his late 20s maybe. And he's kind of on the scene, got a nice job, making some good money, trying to find a girl or a woman, to hang out with. And it was fun to sort of discover his voice in that time. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't much weight there. I didn't have a big problem. And then when I came back to it, actually years later, I kind of said, all right, so, they often said that people's first novels are somewhat autobiographical. And I know that in my own life, my parents who, wonderful parents, have been having a hard time post-Katrina. They've had some issues with losing their house. They had some health problems. And so I said, what if this guy's issue in this book is that he is trying to protect his parents from the effects of Hurricane Katrina, which was, people often forget this, but Hurricane Katrina wasn't a natural disaster, so to speak. Of course, there's the hurricane itself that came in and did its own thing, but it's only a Category 3 storm. We had experienced that in New Orleans, where I'm from, many times. The real problems with that, one, on the front end, you had governmental neglect, so that the levees were not made to stop even a Category 3 storm, which was ridiculous. And then on top of that, you had the things post-Katrina, in which the government acted in so many ways that were just really bad for Black folks. So, they said, hey, your house flooded, you have flood insurance, we're going to pay you 50% of the policy, even though you lost your entire house. We'll make it up to you by giving you this SBA loan from the federal government. But no, we won't give you as much as you need, and you got to pay it back. And if you can't document everything, we'll put you in jail for not documenting everything. So there were so many things tied to that experience. And then there was just the effects of policies in the city with, our mayor at the time, who was actually a Black man, said, we're not going to help Black folks rebuild their houses in these neighborhoods, in these old historic neighborhoods. We're going to let green space take over. They can figure out where they want to live next. Mm-hmm. So that leads to things like gentrification becoming a big part of our experience. So I was thinking about how would my character respond to that in his world. But I'll tell you that, Trayvon Martin died when I was writing the book, and I saw America's response to that. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, people don't know it, but I'm a corporate lawyer. I had been a corporate lawyer, and so I'm working in these big firms. My secretary was a white man who was actually older than me. I mean, how crazy is that? I'm 35 years old with a 44-year-old white male secretary, right? And I remember the day I walked in the office, and I've told us before, it was, Trayvon Martin had been murdered by Zimmerman, and I walked into the firm's kitchen to get lunch or something like that, to get a snack, and my secretary was in there. And I'm like, man, this whole thing with this young man, Trayvon Martin, it's making me so sad right now. And he basically went, you mean that thug that they shot? And the thing about it is, again, if you know people well, you assume the best about them. So this secretary of mine, I call him Jack or whatever like that, right? So, he was a good dude, one-on-one, married, had 3 children. His oldest child was developmentally disabled. He was taking care of that child very well. I thought it was just, but then I recognized in that moment how you could be a quote unquote good person and just have this really evil attitude towards Black folks, which is the same attitudes that the slave owners had, hundreds of years ago. We're going to start the best country in the world by stealing land from the Native Americans and breaking our deal with the British and the king. But it's okay because we're good people. And so those ideas all came together, and I kept thinking, well, what would my narrator be dealing with in his world? And basically, it was trying to protect at first it was his daughter, and I changed the daughter to a son. So he was trying to protect his son from all of these sort of cancerous effect of racism within the world, and that's what he's really fighting from the first page to the last.
Okay. And so, wow. And so that makes the decision for dystopia so much more poignant, I think. Because a lot of people are living their real life apocalypse, real life dystopia already. I saw an article where an indigenous scholar was talking about how a lot of people are sort of in a panic now because of COVID-19 and the way that it shifted so many things. But for indigenous people, upheaval has been in a constant state of existence.
Yes.
And so, and for a lot of Black folks as well, this is all dystopia is sort of the reality. And so, and thinking about that, I want to talk about how We Cast a Shadow has been categorized as a dystopian fiction novel. I'm interested in how you would define dystopian fiction for yourself, but also how do you feel about your work being categorized as dystopian fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I find it slightly amusing, but only because I think like a lot of writers, I'm the last person to categorize my own writing.
Yeah.
So like I remember I had published a series of short stories, and I was at Bona. So Bona is a writers conference and workshop for people of color and Black folks, and I'm on the board now. But so back then I was one of the students. This is 2016, and somebody was talking about speculative fiction and like writing sort of futuristic, stories of Black folks in the future. And I was like, man, I couldn't imagine doing that. And then she turned to me and she said, but Maurice, you've done it like in your last 4 stories. Like they were all set in the future. I'm like, oh, I guess you're right about that. And with this novel in particular, it's been categorized in ways I didn't expect. I mean, people have called it dystopia first. And then, on the cover of the book, there was a quote from Roxane Gay. She called it satirical. Well, I'm not going to disagree with Roxane Gay. I mean, my goodness, she is a genius, right? So I understand that point of view. People have even called it horror. And I was like, okay, yeah, I could sort of rock with that a little bit. I think the thing about dystopia is that I think we need to sort of put things in the boxes to sort of figure out how to approach it as we read it. Because, if you see a comedian and you don't know he's a comedian, you will kind of go, what's wrong with that person? Their opinions are so thrown off. I think calling it dystopian, in some sense, for some people, and again, this is probably more for people who are not Black, it makes them sort of feel comfortable about it. Like I have this whole theory, and I'm going to write about it one day, that the reason why so many novels about slavery have been so successful, especially after Beloved by Toni Morrison. Like I think she broke new ground. I think she told that story in a way it hadn't been told before. Before that, it was always, slavery was a good institution. Margaret Mitchell writes Gone with the Wind. And you read this book and you're like, wow, that's really cool to be on a plantation. Big house and you're dressing nice all the time. You got your makeup on and people working for you. And then Toni Morrison sort of broke that thing open and said, no, wait a minute. And of course there was some other people in between those two. But I think that people often read books about race that are set in the deep past and kind of go, oh, well, thank goodness we've gotten past all those issues. And the reason why is because in our educational system, typically, even for Black people, what happens is that the story is, look, we had slavery, then we had Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth, and they worked it out, fixed it, so like it was that bad. Then we had the Civil Rights Movement, made it, better, so things got almost fixed. Now, present day, it's all done, And I think if you
assume a sort of linear progress within history, and that's not really
the graph is like that. I mean, it's just all like this. It's just getting better constantly. That whole moral of the universe thing, right? And I think if you call it dystopia, you kind of go, yeah, things can't be that bad. They'll never get that bad, even if they actually are that bad right now.
Yeah.
And in my mind, because as a writer, you're always trying to frame things in a way that makes it easy for you to digest personally, and also easy for you to create from that idea. And so I tell people, for example, my theory, I'm gonna write about this one day as well. My theory is that almost every major American franchise is essentially a Black or person of color or indigenous story where they have basically whitewashed it. So perfect example is if you take Hunger Games with Katniss, everything, right? I enjoyed the movie very much. It's this dystopian future. It's post-America. It's called Pan Am. The country is divided in these various districts where they produce like wheat and meats and fish and things like that. And the rich people live in District 1, which is based in New York City. So if you swap out that young white woman, that young white girl, Katniss, you make her Black, right? So you put, I don't know, you name somebody, put them in that role. Put a young Issa Rae in that role, or put Lena Waithe in that role, right? All of a sudden you recognize that that's really a story about Blackness. It's a story in which somebody is told, hey, if we know things are kind of messed up, but if you trust us and follow without propaganda, we'll give you an opportunity to get a piece of this pie that we over in District 1 get. We're gonna make you famous and wealthy and safe, and we'll take care of your family too, why not? And so if you're willing to murder people and commit crimes and just be a part of this horrible thing that is part of our sort of capitalist system, we're gonna save you essentially. You put a Black person in, that's basically a lot of the Black experience. I'm not saying that all Black experience is like that, but I think that listening to people like Isabel Wilkerson, for example, with her new book, Caste, and this idea that we have these invisible categories in which we're all put. A lot of these mainstream characters, again, a Katniss Everdeen, a Luke Skywalker, Professor X and Magneto and X-Men, they're all just like Black folks, even to the point where, Professor X is just MLK. Let's work on things as a team to make things better and not be violent. And Magneto is just Malcolm X. We got to fight, get our guns out. We're gonna, start a revolution. We're gonna take them down and make our own peaceful society in the future. People like us to be safe. So my point is that these things may feel dystopian because we're sort of playing a game with ourselves. And even myself, I know I was doing it during the process of writing. It's kind of saying, yeah, this is set in the future. Why not? But I know for a fact that almost everything in that book, I intentionally selected the incidents so that they've almost all happened to somebody in real life, from being put over by a cop for no apparent reason and just beaten up, to having the cops monitor your house for no apparent reason, to having your child policed in school just because of the color of their skin, to the skin cream issues. I mean, it's been funny over the past few months watching people like read my book and then go online and say, did you see this in this We Cast a Shadow? It's just happened. This thing with what is it? Fair and Lovely, the French company making the skin lightener, changing the name of it because they were feeling ashamed that they were encouraging people to basically destroy their Blackness, whether they were Indian or Korean, to get rid of the melanin in their skin. So these things are all things that are happening constantly. And again, it was almost easy for me to write the book just saying, I'll take something from column A, column B, column 7, column blue, and these are all real things, and it just makes for, I think, a compelling, realistic read that feels dystopian.
Interesting. I like what you're getting at with the temporality piece, and sort of future, not future, what is future. And so I want to talk a little bit more about your novel's relationship to temporality as it relates to the idea of the dystopian. So we know the novel is set in a southern city that appears to be based on New Orleans if you pick up certain markers in the book, in this near future. And so you kind of alluded in this, in your previous answer, sort of about this idea with time and what the idea of future, not future, can kind of make us do. But I'm curious about like how actually near in the future in the story are we really talking about? Like how near is the future in We Cast a Shadow? And what do you think is the real power or significance of the concept of near future in conjunction with dystopia and talking about storytelling?
Great question. I don't think, I've been interviewed a lot. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that question before. I think And again, some of these things when you're working on it is almost subconscious. Like you're not like, this is why I'm doing this thing. But I think that what it ended up being was this. So in my mind, my narrator is like my grandson's generation. So in one part of the book, he actually meets his grandfather. He's already known him from the past. He's talking to his grandfather about, being a black man in America, and his grandfather is saying these things to him. So I would think that the book is probably set between 40 and 50 years in the future.
Okay.
I think that one of the effects of the way that the book can be read is that, if you were to go back in time and talk to Harriet Tubman in like 1905, so she's retired, she's up in that nice house that they paid for, she's just sort of minding her own business, and you asked her, so what it's going to be like in 50 years, like by 1965-ish or something like that, right? Yeah. And she might answer it two ways. She might go, I fought so hard to help free our people, like with my own hands, my own feet. I'm literally the first black person who was in the military. She was paid by the military at one point. In fact, she was the first woman also in the military. So she would say, I fought this hard, and if things can change that much for me in my lifetime, I can only imagine how free my grandkids will be. But she also might say, I could imagine knowing how white folks have been in this country, including the good white folks, the ones who kind of sat on their hands through a lot of these battles. She might say, it won't change that much. And I could also imagine somebody who was very optimistic in the past. Like say a Shelby Steele from 20 years ago, a conservative black man who worked for President Bush, I think the first Bush and the second Bush. He might say, things are getting better really, really fast. I think for any of these black people from the past, if you brought them to now, particularly like during June, during those protests, they would wonder, how is this possible? How is it that things are so bad that the entire world basically caught on fire in response to it? And I think that one of the things that happens to us, because we're human, black folks are humans, that we have this sense of, look, we've defeated this problem, this problem, this problem. Therefore, it makes sense to be hopeful that this will be solved at some point in the near future. And I think that for me, by setting the book in the future, is like saying, well, no, actually, no. I mean, some of the old problems will die. So direct slavery, for example, will go away.
But has it?
There you go, right? Because it's all relative.
We'll get into that a little bit later on. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that when I was young, I was probably like, yes, it's going to be fine. Like, we're going to intermarry, be like a mixed race society. We're going to fix all the laws up. We're going to have like good, banking programs, equal education. But then I look around and kind of go, wait a minute, like the schools are as segregated today as they were in '68 before the rulings came out, before Brown versus Board back in the 50s. So it raises the question, what does it mean to look at temporality? What does it mean to look at time? It's the idea of, I can easily see like anybody, a black man or a white man in a top hat with like, a cane, and when this little funny bow tie, I can see like a woman, like wearing like a petticoat, like a hoop skirt, and having a parasol, and being like, "Don't worry, one day it's gonna be great." And then you fast forward, it's the same person like wearing 60s style, like an afro, or like with the little power fist in the afro, and like a white dude with like long scraggly hair and a beard, and they're saying the exact same thing over and over again. We're almost there. We've almost crossed. We've gotten to the top of the mountain. It's right. I can see it right there. Right, the mountain is right there. The mountaintop is right there, and it's like no. And I just think that at the end of the day, the reason I thought to put that as a part of the book is because we delude ourselves into thinking that we've actually moved a lot further than we have. We've changed a lot, but have we healed ourselves? Not at all.
Interesting. So then that leads me into another question. So I guess you could say then that dystopia as a modality was really necessary or appropriate for you to utilize to tell the story if we cast a shadow, because dystopia really helps us complicate this internalization of this notion that social progress is linear. I mean, could you speak to that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I'll give him credit. I know he's controversial, but Sean King is the person I heard from. I thought about this because of him. He came to New Orleans back in 2017, so I was finished with the book by that point, but helped me frame the idea. So he was giving a presentation at Xavier University, which is a historically Black college and university, in near my house actually. So he was talking about some German philosophers he had read and these ideas of social change and progress. And I think he may have insinuated that Dr. King got it from this same philosopher. I'm not sure if he said that or not, but he put a big graph on the board, and it was that idea of this sort of like this line that goes like that. And it's the idea that if you just sort of hang in there, there's some endpoint. You get to 100% and things have been fixed, you know? And then he said, no, if you look at like history more directly, like actual incidents and events, you know, world wars, economic struggles and changes, really it's more like this.
Yeah.
Okay, and he's like, the scary thing that we don't like to think about is that if that is actually the way things are, then you never know whether you're like at a peak or at a valley. And it's very possible, for example, you know, on the day that the present president was elected, we entered like a valley. And it's been getting deeper and deeper and deeper. We're still going down right now. And when you're within those moments, you don't know where the bottom is. It's like you have fallen off a cliff, you know, at night, you cannot see where the bottom is. And is the bottom, you know, is it more rock or is it a river? You know, is it like a cloud? Is it some trees? You have no idea what that thing is. And so I think that for me, when I think about those concepts, you know, dystopian is a way to make it palatable for some people, I think, because if the story really was a sort of Dickensian tale, but like just like things getting worse on every page, people kind of go, no, we don't read that anymore in America. We passed that, you know, like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle or whatever, you know, 120 years ago. So these days, you know, we need a little something. It's like when you're trying to feed your dog a heart pill and you like put it in the food first. It's kind of like that. Dystopian is a medium for getting some of these ideas into the public discourse, because I think that people have a limit on how much they'll take. You know, I think that there's a reason why there's certain kinds of books about race that, you know, I can't throw much shade on them, but if you look at the most popular fiction books, often there's this arc of, well, it was this one person, often a woman, who was experiencing racism. And then by the end of that book, her problem is solved, as if her problem being solved is a solution for all of us. And it's not how it works at all. And I think that while that feeling and that idea, you know, I'll call them out, like that makes the NPR crowd feel good about themselves. See, we're working on these things. You know, we're chipping away at it. But I think that ignores what's really going on. And it's really as if, you know, racism was diabetes. And you're like, well, if I just take this medicine, it doesn't matter if I'm being fed a cake, you know, for dinner before I go to bed. I'll just take some medicine more. It's like, no, you're actually destroying your body bit by bit by bit. It's going to be a process. And you have like flare-ups sometimes, but you are still in this area of harm constantly as a result of that.
You're giving such like brilliant answers. I'm processing everything. But I like this idea that dystopia is one way for Americans to sort of disrupt all the sort of PR stuff that we believe about our country, which we know really is just PR, because we know, I mean, you brought up Upton Sinclair, labor exploitation is still happening in every sort of sphere of the workforce in this country. Classism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, all of these systems are constant.
Right now, let's feed the workers to the economy. Let's not give them any relief in their unemployment benefits, because we just feed them into the system. Now get things rolling again. It's like, oh.
But this is always, I mean, this is part of, even if people haven't really started thinking about it until recently, this has always been an issue within this country of the worker is always expendable. So that's, you know, we can't get into a huge labor and working class history right now.
No, but I will say.
But like, that's part of the labor exploitation is part of one of the sort of the binding threads of sort of American exceptionalism, if you will.
And that's how the caste system works. Because if you see somebody with dark skin, you say, well, in this caste, they're automatically part of that labor system. So even though some of them are white, you know, the vast majority of us are Black and brown people, and that's the expendable class. It's the reason why in New Orleans, you know, the pandemic started in some sense in New Orleans and New York, and we got hit really hard, really fast. And I remember looking on Facebook and seeing dozens die every single day. and thinking, why is this happening here now? And even seeing the national discourse change from, this is a serious problem to, oh, it's just black people in New Orleans dying. Okay, it ain't that bad. That's when, in my mind, you saw the Republicans kind of go, yeah, we ain't gotta take it too seriously. Forget the mask, forget the aid. I don't want to get too distracted on it, but it is of a piece, this idea of who, you know, it's like in that, it's in that Kanye song he was using Gil Scott-Heron. Who will survive in America? You know, we're reproducible. You know, we're fine. You can put us in jail. You know, you can let us die. There's more of us to come. And that's why we got to fight. Because if we let it go where they wanted to go, we'll just die in record numbers. We'll just keep dying and dying and dying, and no tears will be shed on our behalf.
Well, I mean, you're not wrong, but this brings me to thinking about people dying in record numbers, Black and brown people in particular dying in record numbers in cities, makes me think about the decision for you to locate this novel within a Southern city. And why do you think rendering dystopian within a Southern urban space was necessary or more appropriate than rendering dystopian within like a Southern rural space or a Southern small town space?
Yeah, well, I mean, the true answer is not, I'm not lazy, I'm a hard worker. But I do like to take, you know, I like to take those paths that have a certain elegance to them. So it was easy for me to pick a New Orleans type Southern city. Mm-hmm. But more importantly and more interestingly, I think the reason why I did that is because cities are the places, particularly in the South, that reveal the lies of the American experiment, the things that are in the Constitution, the things the founding fathers supposedly said, the propaganda, the PR. You go to an American city, you see it immediately. I mean, and again, I don't want to keep going back to Hunger Games, but just for example, District 1 is New York, basically. You go to New York City, and I got a lot of friends there, you know, they're people like anybody else, right? But you know in New York, if you have the good fortune, so to speak, to be in those sort of high circles, like the artistic, educated class, you know, you go like to the fancy, this is pre-pandemic, you go to the fancy restaurants, you go to the museums, you go to the fundraisers, and what you'll see is what you see in most parts of America. You will see that, you know, most cities anyway, you know, the people running things are white liberals, right? So these people who have this sort of disposable income where they can actually go to New York City, work for a publisher, for example, for $25,000 a year in New York City, which today, if you don't know in the future, is no money at all, right? It may sound like a lot of money 100 years ago, but it's no money at all because they have a trust fund or other backups that allow them to sort of just go into that space and absorb that experience. Where if, you know, you're the average Black person, where you have the 1/6 of the wealth of a white person, you can't experience that. So what happens is, you know, a lot of the Black, brown, indigenous folks, trans and queer people in New York, they're living a different life. You know, they're not in that sort of educated artistic class. You know, just like in New Orleans, I could be at a fundraiser in New York and I could notice that, well, wow, everybody who's on stage, everybody's sitting like in the main parts of the audience, for the most part, are white. And then people are serving the food and pick up the trash and serving the alcohol, they're Black or brown or, you know, yada, yada, yada. And so what's happening is you go to a city and people are saying, you know, these are the great beacons of light in America. You know, we won't proclaim ourselves to be capitalists, even though we are, but, you know, still, we are the proof that anything is possible. What they're really saying is that, no, we're the snobs. Now, and I say that for a reason, because my belief is that racism, and anti-Blackness at its core is about a certain snobbiness. So we have, to me, the easily visible city liberal snobs who are kind of like, hey, I have no problem with Black people at all. But like if you got like inside of their heads, so like if they were like scrolling their words across their foreheads, you would see commentary about how they're better. You know, it's like, well, you know, I'm gonna donate $1,000 of your tax deductible to some, you know, Black charities, like help these Black folks, you know, better their lives. Versus, well, how about like getting rid of, you know, banking policies that exclude us from getting loans? You know, it's like your dad is the president of that bank. That's how you got your money. You know, you saw it in Native Son by Richard Wright, which was written in the freaking 1930s and 40s, where he illustrates in that book so clearly how you could have the white father in that book owning half of the South Side, not fixing up any departments where the main characters stay at, and then overcharging them on rent so that actually you're paying more money to be poor and black in the ghetto than you're paying to be white in the suburbs. So these things are all connected. And again, it hasn't really changed. I mean, it's the exact same thing today, even to the point where in my neighborhood in New Orleans, where I've been for I've been there my entire life, my house now is, I think I'm 16 years into it. And I've seen how it was impossible for any brother or sister to get a loan from a bank to like start a restaurant or a hair salon. We had those things, but you could tell they were underfunded. Like the signs were like rickety handmade signs. It wasn't like some flashy $25,000 sign. You go into the hair salon, it's like, all right, it hasn't been painted in 20 years. There's a cracked window. And then I saw immediately post Katrina, when the money started flooding into these zones, these economic empowerment zones, and seeing like a white guy from Atlanta open like $1 million burger joint. And this white lady from like Connecticut opened like this really fancy dessert restaurant, and being like, okay, some of them were like rich from their family, but some of them got loans from these banks right next door to my house. So it's just, these things are so embedded into our society. And it's a shame that it takes so much power and energy from our smartest people to describe it to ourselves, and then have this sort of shame of the average American not even wanting to hear those experiences. Because if you consider yourself to be a good liberal white American, you're thinking, well, I'm not part of that. And that's one of the greatest tragedies of what's happening in our society right now. People keep saying, not me. Either I'm not a slave owner, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, we're all morally pure. It's like, well, no, you're benefiting from the system, and it's propping you up every single day. You don't want to acknowledge it, but it's right there in front of your face. And I'll just say, for me, one of the people who did it best in a book was Michelle Alexander, New Jim Crow. I thought that in that book, she laid it out so clearly, even for skeptics. But she would say, well, maybe you don't believe this, but check the stats for yourself. And she even had a chapter about New Orleans, where she takes Tulane University, and she talks about how in the frat houses, if you went there, like on any given day, you would find, meth, heroin, cocaine, crack, LSD, mescaline, ayahuasca, and the cops never ever go to that university, not to visit, not to look around. And yet, those same police would like go to my neighborhood, do a raid, find some brother in there with like, a half pound of heroin, and put him in jail for the rest of his life. And so it's just all in front of our faces. And you can just follow the money. If the money's going to the police, right? Well, where are the police going? And then when they arrest somebody, where does that person go? How long do they stay there? I mean, I keep hearing stories over and over again about like, the police arrest a couple. It's a white person and a black person. And then the cops literally say to the white person, in fact, this is the true story. This is Chelsea Handler, the comedian, and she had her own talk show. She had a black boyfriend 20 years ago. She's famous now. They had drugs in the car. The cops pulled him out the car, her and him. They told her, "You go home, sweetie." And then they arrested him. Similar story is told by Janelle Monáe on her album. I think it's the song American, I forget the proper title. It's talking about like being in the car with her boyfriend. They both get arrested, go to court. He gets probation with no time at all. She has to go work like as like a maid somewhere, something like that. Mm-hmm. So this is just all a part of like this whole caste structure that is so embedded and so obvious. It's right in front of our eyes.
Again, so much to unpack. But very true that cities sort of lay bare the dishonesties that Americans tell themselves every day about their countries. And since you've spoken about the police portion, we don't have much time left, but I want to definitely get to that, because that's a big part of sort of the novel's humanization, I feel like, of the narrator, where we really get to see why he is the way he is. So I want to speak about sort of carceral violence and the prison industrial complex. And your novel really highlights, obviously, anti-Blackness and the prison industrial complex and the connections between the two, and how carceral violence just enacts and delivers trauma onto so many Black families and Black communities. Obviously, this is not just an issue that affects Black people. We know brown folks, indigenous people, queer and trans people, and of course, even working class white folks who sometimes get left out of these conversations. But of course, your novel is dealing with how it affects a lot of Black communities and Black families. So as I said before, carceral violence really sort of injects this trauma into the genealogy of the narrator's family, where it just dramatically shapes how he interacts with his male relatives, particularly his son and his father. I mean, his father, we see gets attacked by Officer Dred Douglas, which the naming for that was Dred Scott and Frederick Douglass, but gets attacked by this Officer Dred Douglas, who has accused him of stealing a beach bike or something like that. And he defends the narrator's mother from getting assaulted, and of course is then attacked and is convicted of this charge and ends up prison for life in Liberia, which is the narrator's home state's oldest continuous running prison, which we know is based on Angola. And for those who will be watching later on who don't know, in Angola, you do not get parole. You serve the whole sentence. There is no parole in Angola. Angola is one of the most notorious prisons in the South. It is in Louisiana. And Louisiana is one of the most heavily incarcerated states in the country. And the South as a whole contains many states that are the most heavily incarcerated states in the country. And so this is a big Southern issue. And so continuing with that, I really want you, if you can, speak to this rendering of trauma and genealogy and carceral violence in connection to this idea of dystopia.
Yeah, I mean, it is not a design flaw, it's a part of the design. And I mean, again, if you took one of our ancestors from like 1850, you teleported them to Angola, they look around and be like, "Wait, what's changed, huh?" I mean, Parkman, you know, I mean, it's the same thing with all these prisons where they are designed, like so many of the systems in this country, to basically tear us apart. I mean, I get so infuriated. Like, if you want to see me get really mad really fast, like watching people on TV talking about, oh, you know, Black fathers don't take care of their sons, the Black community only had like more morals, they spent more time in church. I'm like, no, y'all fought an illegal drug war where you imported drugs into the Black community for decades. And then in exchange for that, you sent guns down to South America, Latin America, Central America, Mexico, and you use those guns to destabilize their communities and their countries. And then back here,
U.S. empire, yeah.
Absolutely. And then you put so many Black men and women as well in jail, so that you know, people, often white folks in rural communities, would have a place to work, because now you get this big prison. It's the biggest employer in a lot of places throughout the South, right? So that's feeding their families, right? Then you get out of jail, and because of the surveillance state, which has only gotten more powerful, people kind of go, well, you were in prison once, right? Well, you can't have a real job or real education. You can't get any federal housing. You can't get any support for any of these things, right? So, you know, find the worst job possible. And so then you do all those things to people as a people, and then you say, well, what's wrong with y'all? And you put that next to the fact that, you know, as Michelle Alexander pointed out, Black people don't use drugs at any higher rate than white people. It's a matter of who do we decide we're going to arrest for these things. Mm-hmm. And I just think that the carceral state, which I often think of in my mind as a cancerial state, it's just one of these things that is really just made to destroy as much as possible. In the same way that we can look today back at, you know, slavery on plantations, Greek slavery, you can look at the way we treated women before the right to vote, and you say, well, that's just so wrong. How could they do that? I have no doubt that people are doing it right now, obviously, but people will look back at this time and they will go, what was wrong with that country? Like, why do they do these things to people? And I can only say that there's a level of like sadism in it, and there's a level of just wanting to watch goodness in life be destroyed before your eyes. You know, I've visited many prisons. I've had clients in prison. I know what it's like. I mean, I remember one time I went to a prison to visit somebody, and I saw the warden, who was only like a 40-year-old white dude, walk into the prison with his fishing pole. And he was like just coming like to check on like his stock, basically. You know, everything going right here? And then going back out this pickup truck, get his truck and riding off to go fish. And just thinking about, you know, what does that say about us as a nation? And so
we're very comfortable with having like a permanent underclass and a permanent sort of oppressed caste. And we know also that a lot of these private prisons are involved in labor exploitation, using folks as firefighters, but you know, not necessarily offering parole or shortening sentences or being able to expunge records or anything like that. The legacy of chain gangs and convict lease labor systems. And it's just, a lot of us are just, we want to ignore it, but we are really comfortable with having a permanent underclass. And again, that's Americans buying into sort of our own PR about, you know, our exceptionalism and yada, yada, yada. But it's really horrendous, honestly. And I'm glad your novel exposes that. And again, it takes me back to that point of what you said of cities sort of exposing the dishonesty that we ignore about where we live. As the narrator points out, when you get out of the airport, one of the first things visitors can see in the city is Liberia. And so it's this looming force. And as he points out, it employs thousands of people. So folks are dependent upon people constantly being surveyed and exploited. But we just don't like to think about it because, again, Americans buy into our own PR about how great we are when that is really a lot more complicated. So we're running out of time, but I do have one last question. We've kind of been a little bit darker in tone for a lot of the conversation, but fast forwarding towards the end of the novel, the narrator's son Nigel and his childhood friend turns puppy love, turns life partner and mother of his child, Araminta, have sort of completely divested from the narrator and the societal expectations of what social mobility and success look like within a white supremacist capitalist framework in the city. They've divested by going to a Southern rural space and joining a multicultural, multi-ethnic commune. And so I really want you to speak about how dystopian fiction in your story seems to point to the potential for freedom and new creation in like a rural Southern setting. We see that they head out to Appalachia, actually, which gets unloaded with a lot. And even there's been conversations about how whiteness is sometimes conditional for working class white Appalachians because of all these things that get loaded onto them that are typically loaded onto Black and brown folks. So this choice to kind of have Nigel and Araminta find freedom in a rural Southern space, it's just really interesting to me. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, Araminta and Nigel are my heroes. I mean, that's why I put them in there. I needed somebody like to be speaking the truth and to be fighting against this. And when I think about Black folks in rural spaces, what I think is that those are the true American freedom fighters. You know, when I think about people like Martin Luther King and our obvious heroes, they could not have existed without the rural people who birthed them, you know, their ancestors. And I think about how when I was younger, I would think about, oh, the country, you know, why would I want to be a Black person in the country? But I think, no. You see how the language, the folkways, the fighting spirit has never been broken. And you compare that to the fact that in cities, it is much, much easier for, again, the government, which is white supremacists, to put all these systems in place to degrade our lives. So I mean, look, New Orleans is a police state, like America's police state.
Mm-hmm.
And like all these cities are police states. The fact is, you have 2,000 cops, 500 police cars, 3 tanks, 2 police RVs, 25 police horses. You got cameras on almost every other block now. You got helicopters. People like watching your Wi-Fi to see what you're talking about. In those spaces in the cities, it's all designed to, again, feed that system. But in the rural spaces, there is more space for that Black love. I think about, of course, Jessamine Ward and what she's done in her books, particularly for me, Savage to Bone.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, Kieshe, what he did in Long Division, in Heavy, I just think that reverse propaganda is when you ignore the beautiful true stories. And one of the most beautiful true stories of the Black experience in America is how much raw power and love exists in Black rural spaces. And even the fact that like so much of American cuisine, music, style, when we talk, comes straight from the country. And if there's no Black South, there's no America. Because what is America? America's basically like, you got like rock and roll, which came out of like, blues and R&B and gospel. You think about the way we talk. I mean, it's like, I always find it amazing people like, white supremacists want to get rid of Black people. What's left? I mean, what is it, like Scotland? I don't know. What are you trying to recreate in America? I mean, even the banjo is a freaking Black instrument that was brought over straight to the South and was played for a very long time. And they try to suppress those stories. And so now you have, Rhiannon Giddings, she is a genius of the banjo and showing us, no, we still got this. This is still our instrument today. So my point is that I think, and again, it's subconscious, by sending them to this rural space, they were saying, you know what, we can free ourselves. You can make the mistake of the father, the narrator, and try and fight within this framework. Try and say that, well, white supremacist capitalism isn't that bad. I can survive here. Or you can say, no, I ain't gotta do this. I can just be with the person I love the most and try and make a community that is built upon, meeting my most basic needs and just not causing any more harm to people. I don't have to like keep on pushing these ideas about white being better than Black and yada, yada, yada. I can be free, I can be loved, I can be happy. And that's how I set that up.
I love that. I love that the rural South at the end is like the representative of hope, and where you get to see sort of multiracial cooperation, which people tend to not associate with rural spaces, where you get to see a divestment from capitalism, which again, folks don't necessarily think about in conjunction with rural spaces, where you get to see people who are accepted for, who accept themselves and who accept others for who they are in rural spaces. And I love the idea of the rural South being this beacon of freedom and a space to sort of divest and really begin to think about what the real potentialities for liberation across the South for Black and brown people, Indigenous people, queer folks, trans folks, working class people, and just the spectrum, like what liberation for all those groups can look like and how it can begin in the rural South. So unfortunately, that is how we'll have to end for today, but thank you so much for speaking with me. I really enjoyed talking with you. We Cast the Shadow is a really wonderful book. And so I hope all of those who will watch this video will go ahead and get a copy. So thank you again for speaking with me, and, peace and blessings.
Those are great questions. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. And I'll be seeing everybody at some point in the future, I guess.
Yep. Glad to have you. And, we'll be looking forward to your new work in 2021, The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, right?
That's right.
All right. Over and out.